Victory in war is often measured in territory, but behind the scenes of the Second World War, a different kind of battle raged. A war of egos, doctrines, and the stinging weight of institutional arrogance. It is June 1944, and as the Allied forces grind forward in Normandy, an explosive confrontation is brewing behind closed doors between the aggressive, tactical maverick Lieutenant General George S. Patton and the tradition-bound Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. When the smoke of the battlefield clears, one must ask, was the most dangerous threat to the liberation of Europe truly the enemy in the trenches, or the bitter divide hiding at the very heart of the Allied command? The morning air in Normandy was thick with the scent of salt and the heavy atmosphere of uncertainty as Allied forces fought to establish their foothold on the French coast. While soldiers struggled against the tide and the formidable defenses, a stark contrast emerged in the quiet, wood-paneled officer clubs of London. Here, the discourse was not of bravery or sacrifice, but of condescension. A British colonel, shielded by the safety of distance, dismissed the American contribution as that of inexperienced children playing at the complex game of warfare. This statement, carried by the currents of military bureaucracy, eventually reached the ears of a man who possessed no tolerance for such attitudes. General George S. Patton, known for his obsession with military history and his uncompromising approach to command, received the report with a cold, calculated calm. He was not merely a soldier, he was a student of Caesar and Napoleon, someone who viewed war as a contest of speed, will, and precision. Patton understood that the alliance was at a critical juncture where the perception of competence could be as decisive as any tactical maneuver. The rivalry between the American and British commands was not merely a matter of temperament, but a fundamental disagreement on the conduct of modern warfare. 5 years of conflict had forged a specific identity within the British military establishment, one defined by caution, meticulous planning, and a deep-seated belief in their role as the seasoned mentors to their younger, albeit more heavily equipped allies. To them, the massive influx of American men, money, and machinery felt like an overwhelming force that lacked the finesse and experience born of long, painful years under the shadow of the occupation. They viewed the American approach, characterized by a rapid, almost impatient commitment of resources, as a lack of professional maturity. Patton, conversely, saw this caution as a relic of a bygone era. He realized that the war in the West could not be won through the gradual attrition of the past. It required a new tempo, one that the old guard seemed determined to resist. He began to compile evidence, not with the intent of mere rebuttal, but to fundamentally alter the power dynamics of the coalition. He tasked his staff with gathering data that would be undeniable, covering everything from logistics, turnaround times, to the speed of objective achievement. Patton's preparation was nothing short of total. He demanded ironclad statistics, knowing that in the realm of high-level command, data was the only currency that could not be easily devalued by rank or tradition. His staff worked tirelessly, documenting every engagement, every supply chain metric, and every casualty ratio. They were creating a narrative of performance that would challenge the institutional assumptions of the British High Command. Patton was preparing to enter the room not as a supplicant, but as an authority who held the receipts for the American Army's rapid maturation on the battlefield. He was keenly aware of the demographic and industrial shifts that were rendering the old imperial strategy obsolete. He understood that the center of gravity in the war was moving across the Atlantic, and he was determined to ensure that this reality was reflected in the operational hierarchy of the Allied forces. As the reports accumulated, the picture became clear. The inexperienced newcomers were consistently outperforming their professional counterparts in terms of speed, adaptability, and the effective application of combined arms. The meeting itself was a study in controlled tension. When Patton met with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in the senior British command, he did not start with a confrontation. He opened with a display of professional courtesy, stressing the need for better coordination. However, once the discussion turned to the nature of their respective roles, Patton deftly shifted the focus to the numbers. He presented the comparisons as cold, hard facts, letting the statistics speak for themselves. The room went silent as the disparities in performance metrics were laid bare. Patton's argument was precise, his tone balanced and authoritative. He pointed out that while Britain had endured 5 years of hardship, the rapid American mobilization had achieved in 30 months what had eluded the Allied forces for much longer. He framed this not as a boast, but as a recognition of the shifting realities of global power and military capacity. The British officers, accustomed to a status quo that favored their long experience, were now forced to confront a document that questioned the very foundation of their perceived superiority. The reaction of the British command was a mixture of frustration and a dawning realization that the landscape of the war had fundamentally changed. Montgomery, a man of immense stature and rigid adherence to doctrine, found himself in a position where the usual justifications of experience no longer held the same weight. He attempted to pivot back to the history of the conflict, the early struggles in North Africa, and the resilience of the Commonwealth forces. But Patton, prepared with the same efficiency he demanded from his divisions, was ready. He did not dismiss the sacrifices of the British, but he refused to allow them to be used as a shield against necessary innovation. He emphasized that the alliance's primary goal was the defeat of the common enemy, and that this could only be achieved if they moved beyond the outdated hierarchy. The argument was, at its heart, about the speed of modern war and the ability of an army to adapt to the fluid, high-tempo nature of the conflict. Patton's strategy went beyond the boardroom. He knew that the perception of American inadequacy was a structural issue that required a practical demonstration. He proposed a series of cooperative exercises framed as a way to enhance interoperability, but designed in reality to pit the methods of the two armies against each other in a controlled, highly observable environment. By getting the British to agree to these exercises, he ensured that the lessons learned would be experienced by the men in the field, not just discussed in the high command. He wanted to demonstrate that the American reliance on speed, improvisation, and aggressive use of air and artillery support could consistently yield better results in the complex terrain of Normandy. He was, in effect, forcing a shift in doctrine by making the older, more methodical approach appear increasingly obsolete. The exercises were meticulously planned, and observers from both militaries were present to witness the results. The first of these exercises was a timed armored advance. Both units were given the same maps, obstacles, and objectives. The American unit, led by a colonel known for his focus on momentum, completed the course with a speed that startled the observers. They did not pause at obstacles to reorganize. They adapted, adjusted, and continued, demonstrating a high degree of unit cohesion and a shared understanding of tactical objectives. When the British unit ran the same course, the difference was stark. They approached the obstacles with the caution expected of their doctrine, pausing to reevaluate and reestablish command structures before proceeding. By the time they reached their objective, they had fallen far behind the American time. The numbers were irrefutable, and the message they sent was clear. The exercise showed that the American ability to maintain the tempo was not merely a matter of superior equipment, but a fundamental difference in how they organized for combat. Following the armored advance, the artillery competition took place. This was a critical area, as the effectiveness of artillery often decided the outcome of local engagements. The American batteries utilized new fire control methods that focused on speed and aggressive adjustment, allowing them to deliver precise strikes with minimal downtime. The British, who adhered to a more traditional, methodical approach to fire control, were left scrambling to keep up. One British officer watching the American battery in action described the performance as akin to jazz music, improvisational and energetic. It was a moment of profound realization. They were conducting a symphony, while the Americans were operating with a speed that left little room for the traditional pauses that characterized the old way of warfare. This performance effectively dismantled the argument that the Americans were merely children playing at war. They were, in fact, innovators who had developed a new language of combat. The impact of these exercises was immediate and profound. Among the ranks, the news traveled fast. Soldiers who had long endured the subtle condescension of their counterparts suddenly walked with a renewed sense of purpose. They realized that their leadership stood behind them and had effectively defended their professional competence in the most public way possible. This was a massive morale boost, one that could not be manufactured by pamphlets or posters. It was based on the simple, powerful reality of achievement. The British officers, meanwhile, found themselves in a difficult position. The public dismissals that had been common in the clubs were now muted. They knew that if they spoke in such terms, they could be met with the same cold analytical data that had been used in the conference room. The atmosphere within the alliance began to shift, moving from one of condescension to one of guarded but increasingly functional cooperation. This transition was not without its own challenges. The exchange program that followed was designed to share these new techniques, But it also created new points of friction. As technical details were shared, fire control methods, and armor tactics, the risk of sensitive information falling into the wrong hands increased. The intelligence file that would later appear on Patton's desk underscored the precarious nature of this new openness. Someone somewhere was watching the exchange program closely, and the new efficiency that the Allies were developing was now being scrutinized by the enemy. This created a new kind of tension, one that pitted the need for greater integration against the absolute requirement for operational security. It was a complex game where every move had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical sphere. The threat of security breaches forced a temporary pause in the exchange program, a move that gave comfort to those who had initially resisted Patton's initiatives. Some senior officers pushed for a return to the old ways, arguing that the integration had made the command structure too transparent and vulnerable. They used the security risks as a political lever, trying to reestablish the traditional hierarchies that had been in place before Patton's arrival. But Patton, who was not a man to be swayed by such maneuvers, asked for a short delay. He knew that the success of the new methods would soon be tested in the crucible of live combat. He waited for the results of the breakthrough at St. Lo, confident that once the results were in, the arguments about security would take a secondary place to the realities of operational success. He was betting the future of his program, and by extension the efficiency of the alliance, on the performance of his armored units. As the breakout of Operation Cobra commenced, the results were instantaneous. The 4th Armored Division, following the tactics refined during the exchange program, moved with a speed that the enemy could not match. They bypassed fortified positions, encircled units before they could regroup, and kept up a pace that left their own supply lines struggling to catch up. They moved 60 miles in 36 hours, a pace that was unheard of in the war in the West. The German forces, caught by surprise, were unable to react effectively to the speed of the American advance. Their defensive doctrines, which had relied on a much slower rate of movement, were completely overwhelmed. The logistical systems that had been tested in the exercises now proved their worth under fire, maintaining the necessary supplies to keep the units moving at this unprecedented tempo. The impact of this operation was not just a victory on the field. It was a total vindication of Patton's approach. The intelligence reports that came in afterward from the captured German commanders confirmed what Patton had known all along. The tempo of the American forces was something they had no answer for. They had expected the rate of advance to be consistent with the earlier phases of the war, and their failure to adjust to the new pace had led to their collapse. The breakout opened the door to the rest of Western France, and the momentum created during this period would continue to grow. Patton, having proven his point, now presented the results to his superiors, and the recommendation to cancel the exchange program was quietly shelved. The security protocols were tightened, the program was resumed with better safeguards, and the lesson that efficient integration was vital was permanently etched into the doctrine of the alliance. The aftermath of this period saw a shift in how the alliance operated. The reliance on old myths and institutional assumptions began to fade, replaced by a focus on evidence-based practices. The performance of the 4th Armored Division became the gold standard, and the methods used were studied and codified for future use. The success was not just for Patton or his unit, it was a demonstration for the entire Allied command. It proved that the war could be won by combining the strengths of the different national forces, provided they were willing to learn from each other and discard the baggage of their own institutional past. The alliance was finally beginning to function as a true, integrated partnership, one that relied on a clear assessment of capabilities rather than a hierarchy of prestige. The story does not end with the victory in the field, but with the quiet, lasting legacy of those who were involved. Men like Captain Robert Healy, a history teacher who had recognized the significance of the conflict, not as a soldier, but as a student of the past, played a crucial role in ensuring the argument was won the right way. He had seen the pattern before, the clash between the old and the new, the established and the rising, and had understood that the transition had to be managed with precision. His life after the war, spent teaching the very history he had helped to shape, stands as a testament to the fact that the most impactful moments are often those that go unnoticed by the public eye, but change the course of history for decades to come. The lessons of those few weeks in the summer of 1944 continued to resonate in the doctrines and strategies that the Western world would rely upon for the rest of the century. The end of the war did not bring the peace that Patton had spent his life preparing for. Instead, it brought a new set of challenges that he was fundamentally ill-equipped to manage. As the focus shifted to the administration of a shattered Germany, Patton found himself in a position that required the very skills, patience, political subtlety, and a sensitivity to the complexities of occupation that he had spent his career refining away. His outspoken nature, once an asset in the heat of battle, now became a liability. He expressed views that were increasingly out of sync with the shifting political landscape, and the same tenacity that had once carried him across France now led him into conflict with his own superiors. The man who had been a titan of the battlefield was finding it difficult to navigate the delicate, shifting sands of the post-war world. The reassignment to the 15th Army, a ceremonial role with no real authority, was the beginning of a rapid decline for a man who had only ever known the fire of command. He felt isolated, cast aside by an army and a nation that had moved beyond the need for his specific brand of leadership. He wrote to his wife, expressing his frustration, but even then his mind remained rooted in the past. He saw himself as a soldier without a war, a man built for a conflict that no longer existed. The transition from the high-tempo, life-or-death decisions of the field to the empty halls of military bureaucracy was, for Patton, a slow-motion catastrophe. The irony was that the very man who had forced the alliance to adapt so effectively was now unable to adapt to the new reality himself. The accident on December 9, 1945, was a low-speed event, yet it resulted in injuries that would prove fatal for a man whose body had been pushed to its absolute limit for over 4 decades. As he lay in the hospital in Heidelberg, the contrast between his immense public fame and his profound personal unhappiness was never more evident. He had fought the war as he had lived his life, with an intensity that left no room for anything else. He would never return to the United States, and in his final days, he remained in the lands he had helped liberate, among the soldiers he had once commanded. The end of his life was as quiet as his career had been loud. The legacy Patton left behind was not the man himself, but the doctrine of operational tempo, the belief that the ability to move faster than the enemy is the ultimate arbiter of success. This principle, which had been so effectively proven in Normandy, became the Korea to the jungles of Vietnam. The lessons that Patton had negotiated with Montgomery were refined, taught, and put into practice. The shift from a hierarchy based on tradition to a partnership based on capability became a core tenet of NATO, a structure that would help maintain stability in the volatile decades that followed the war. The argument he had won in that small conference room in France was, in a very real sense, the foundation upon which the defense of the Western world was built for the next half-century. It is important to look beyond the legend of Patton and understand the reality of the institutions he sought to change. Every military given enough time and success develops a mythology that can obscure its own operational reality. This is not necessarily a sign of dishonesty, but rather a common human tendency to value the lessons of the past over the demands of the present. The danger arises when these myths become the lens through which all new information is filtered. Patton's genius was in his ability to see through this lens, to identify the gap between the myth and the truth, and to have the conviction to act on that realization, regardless of the social or political cost. He understood that in the high-stakes world of war, the cost of clinging to uncomfortable, outdated reality is always paid in the lives of the men on the front line. The technical innovations that Patton pushed for, the logistics turnaround, the coordinated fire control, were not just tools, they were reflections of a new way of thinking about organization and performance. They demonstrated that the most effective armies are those that prioritize adaptability and speed, that encourage innovation at all levels of command, and that are willing to constantly reevaluate their own performance. This is why his legacy persists today, not just in the history books, but in the training manuals and the tactical doctrines that guide modern forces across the world. The shift from a rigid, tradition-bound military to one that values data, performance, and agility is perhaps the most significant and least understood outcome of the Second World War. We are reminded of the importance of the true thing, the willingness to speak a difficult truth when silence is more convenient. The captain from Boston, Robert Healy, was a small but significant part of this larger story, a reminder that the truth often needs a champion to bring it into the light. His life, spent in the classroom, is a mirror to the way that historical lessons are passed down, filtered, and finally understood. The story of Patton and Montgomery is, at its heart, a story about the power of an accurate, honest assessment of reality, and the courage it takes to build a strategy upon it. It is a lesson that is as relevant today as it was in the summer of 1944. The dynamics of the Anglo-American alliance remain a compelling subject, not just because of the historical personalities involved, but because of what they reveal about the nature of partnerships between nations. These alliances are rarely straightforward. They are built on a complex foundation of shared interests, personal rivalries, and structural pressures. The transition from one power to another, from the established to the rising, is a delicate process that requires both sides to be willing to redefine their roles. The lesson that Patton was trying to instill, that a strong partnership is one that is based on the reality of the present rather than the prestige of the past, remains a cornerstone of international cooperation. The intellectual shock that comes from reevaluating these events is not about diminishing the role of any one commander, but about recognizing the collective nature of the effort. The victory was not the result of one man's vision, but the outcome of thousands of small, daily decisions made by men and women who were struggling to do their best in an impossible situation. When we challenge the common myths, we do not erase the heroism. We give it a more grounded and therefore more profound meaning. The truth is always more complex and more interesting than the simplified version we are often presented with in popular accounts. Consider for a moment the alternate reality, the one where Patton had stayed silent. If the institutional condescension had remained unchecked, would the tempo of the Allied forces have been the same? Would the breakthroughs have been achieved with the same efficiency? It is a question that highlights the profound impact of one individual's willingness to disrupt the status quo. The catastrophe that might have occurred, in the form of a prolonged, costly, and less efficient campaign, is a stark reminder of why the argument was so necessary. It was not a matter of ego, but a strategic imperative that directly influenced the lives of thousands. The logistical data, the tactical reports, and the after-action reviews, all these are the building blocks of historical record, but they only tell part of the story. The rest is found in the decisions made in the heat of the moment, the arguments held in the private quarters of high command, and the personal convictions that drove individuals to act as they did. By looking at these elements, we gain a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the war, one that honors the complexity of the events and the people who lived through them. It is an approach that respects the history while at the same time challenging us to think more deeply about its implications for our own time. We often look at the Second World War as a monolithic event, a series of great battles and grand strategies. But when we zoom in, we see the frictions, the petty jealousies, and the genuine breakthroughs in cooperation that define the alliance. This is the real history, the one that is found in the margins and the footnotes, and it is the one that gives us the most valuable insights into the nature of leadership and decision-making. By focusing on these details, we do not lose the forest for the trees. We simply gain a better view of the landscape. The journey from a London officers' club to the final liberation of Europe is a story of transition, not just in the military sense, but in the psychological and strategic sense. It is the story of how a group of nations, each with its own history and prejudices, learn to work together to defeat a common threat. It is a story about the power of the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, and about the vital importance of building an alliance on the solid ground of capability rather than the shifting sands of assumption. As we reflect on these events, we are challenged to consider the role that each of us plays in our own institutions. Do we cling to our own versions of mythology? And do we have the courage to challenge them when they no longer reflect the reality of our environment? Patton's story is a call to action, not just for the military, but for anyone who works within a large, complex organization. It is a reminder that the health of any institution depends on its ability to face the truth and to adapt. In the end, the story of George Patton and Bernard Montgomery is a testament to the power of a single, well-argued case. It was a confrontation that almost ended careers and that tested the limits of an alliance, but in the process, it laid the groundwork for a new way of conducting war. This is a story about the evolution of the Allied effort during World War II, a complex, often fraught, and deeply transformative period that continues to hold valuable lessons for the way we understand and organize for the future. If you were in Patton's position, facing institutional resistance, while trying to implement a strategy that you knew would save lives and win the war faster, would you have taken the risk of a career-ending confrontation, or would you have chosen a more diplomatic path? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.